I've wondered what happened to the Garden of Eden. It's really funny how often I'll get that question. Somebody on their, writing along their Bible questions, they say, whatever happened to the Garden of Eden? We know where it was. That's the geographical certainty. It was somewhere near the Euphrates River. And while it's a long river, it's not all that long, but what you know within a reasonable area where the Garden of Eden was. It is the garden that God planted. And the presumption is that the garden was fabulously beautiful. Every fruitful and beautiful plant, that many of the plants were there for food, and probably an awful lot of them were there for decoration. And you can just imagine the hand of God actually laying out, designing, planting, developing a garden. I've seen some awfully lovely gardens in my time. And I can't even imagine, sometimes when you've seen Kew Gardens in England, when you've seen the gardens we had on the college campus over there, you realize what can be done. And then to think of one that God might do is mind-boggling, to say the least. I think a lot of people assume that Adam and Eve did not have to turn a finger, that it was paradise, that all they had to do was just eat the fruit of the trees and make love, I guess. But I don't think we thought about that very far, because when they have made love and their bellies are full, what are they going to do? Talk? What do they have to talk about? Think about it. Or more important, who did they have to talk about? Because that forms an enormous amount of our conversation. But what did they have to talk about? And who did they have to talk about? And what kind of plans could they make? Well, I want to call your attention to a little noticed part of the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. And it's in Genesis chapter 2 in verse 8. The Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. He got them in there for two reasons. One, some trees are great for food. Others are just beautiful to look at. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden. And from there it was parted and came into four heads. Tells you where it is. And the Lord took the man, and he put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. Now, the little secret about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is that they were going to have to work this garden. Dress it. What do? Well, you get out there and you prune trees. You keep the grass out of the flower beds, because they're going to, even if you don't have weeds, you've got grass, and grass is going to run. And so you've got to keep the grass out of the flower beds. You've got to prune the trees. You've got to shape things up. You have a lot of work to do to maintain it. And, of course, you've got to protect it. That's what's involved with keeping it. So they had work. It's really a major task, as any gardener knows, to maintain, improve, and preserve your garden. Now, have you ever wondered what happened to the Garden of Eden, I ask you, whenever Adam and Eve were cast out of it? What happened to it at that point in time? The same thing happened to the Garden of Eden that happens to your garden when you leave it alone. It returns to wrack and to ruin. The grass ran into the flower beds, the trees ran willy-nilly. They eventually probably stopped fruiting because of the fact that they weren't pruned or cut properly or maintained properly. Nothing was done to maintain it. The iron law of entropy did its awful work. And I expect in a few generations you could have wandered by the Garden of Eden and not even been able to tell where it had been. That's just what happens. That is the way things go in the world. Now, everyone knows that it takes a lot of energy to bring order out of chaos. To take something from a chaotic state and to bring it back into order. In Genesis 1, verse 1, we're told this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was chaotic and in confusion. In other words, the earth was a mess. It was in something resembling a state of nature. God, with the expenditure of staggering amounts of energy, brought order out of chaos, and He created the world which we see. Ever since that day, the world has been headed back into a state of chaos. It's the law. Now, if you doubt that, just take it to look at the place where you live. Look at your garage. Look at your room. Look at your sock drawer. Without planning, without attention, and without effort, your home, your garage, your garden, your yard, your car, your life will descend into chaos. That is the way it works. Now, I've told you all that to tell you this. That wasn't the point. Precisely the same thing is true in the area of morals. Just as God imposed order on the universe, just as God imposed order on this planet, and just as He imposed order on the Garden of Eden, He also imposed order on the mind of man. And unless the mind of man is kept and dressed, it will return to a state of nature and utter chaos. Now, I don't think people really think about this very much. I'm indebted to Charles Krauthammer for an essay he wrote not long ago. It was about foreign policy, but he mentioned this little phrase, a state of nature, and how that in this world we live as countries, as nations, and as people in a state of nature. And the implications of it, they had been lost on me up until I read his editorial, and all of a sudden all kinds of things about foreign policy fell into place. But more important than that is the realization that the world is, when it is in a state of nature, is a very undesirable and a very chaotic place to be. And if you look at your children, unless we dress and keep the minds of our children, they will return to a state of nature. And some of them will begin to kill one another. And I don't have to prove that anymore. If I'd given this sermon 20 years ago, and I said, well, now they'll begin to kill one another, just like Cain killed his brother Abel. You all would have sat there, nodded your head, say, well, yes, I guess that's possibly true. And yeah, Cain did kill Abel. But you still would not have been able to come to grips in your mind with anything like what has happened in recent weeks, months, and years in this country. I keep waiting for someone on television, one of the talking heads that's on there talking about all the stuff that's going on. I keep waiting for one of them to ask the question, okay, why did we not have this pattern of school shootings 20 years ago and 30 years ago? Why was it not here then? And what was interesting, somebody pointed out just last night to me, that in fact, 20 and 30 years ago, we had less control over guns than we do now. And I had not realized that, but I know now that it's true. And I realize that I grew up in a gun society. And the guns were carried around the back of pickup trucks. You know, you see them in the window. You had a rifle behind the guy's head and a dog in the back. This is how you know you're in the South. We grew up with guns in the house, guns under the bed, guns on the wall, guns in drawers by the beds and everything else. And not a one of us ever took one of them to school and shot anybody with them. Something's changed. If you're looking for an explanation of school shootings and bombing, here it is. The problem is with the minds of children. By all means, I think we should have laws and rules and efforts to keep guns out of schools. I have no problem with that. But I don't for a minute imagine that you have solved the problem when you have done this. The problem is not with the guns. It's not with the tanks of propane gas. Not with the bombs. The problem is with the minds of children. Something has gone dreadfully wrong in our culture, and the kids are only one symptom of many things that have gone wrong. Many generations ago, a man named Paul wrote to some scattered Christian churches in Rome, and he had this to say. It's in Romans chapter 1 and verse 28. He's talking about man in general, Gentiles in particular. He has quite a few interesting things to say about Gentiles, and how that they, even though they had never had the law of God given to them, nevertheless, it was obvious that they were aware of it. It was written into their hearts and their minds and their consciences. He says, though, that even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a castaway mind to do that which is not convenient. Now, your King James Version says reprobate. And I suppose that's a perfectly adequate translation of it. And if you look up reprobate, I'm not sure what it means. But the denotations of reprobate are more of a deliberate, cynical, aggressive, sinful attitude in mind. Whereas the word that's used in the Greek as Paul writes this letter, he is talking about a mind that has been thrown away, cast away, neglected, and let go. More than a mind that is seriously, aggressively a pursuing of evil. I think we need to understand something here. They did not want to retain God in their knowledge. So God gave them over to a castaway mind. He just gave them up. He just let them go. He allowed entropy to set in, and He allowed their minds to go back to a state of nature, to do those things which are not right, being filled with unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers. Now I can stop right there. We've got a good litany of wretchedness, don't we? We got a terrible list of sin. We got an awful description of a people, a circumstance, a society. But he didn't quit. He went on. He said, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents. I could stop again and we have got our list, haven't we? No, we don't. He goes on. Without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable and unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but take their entertainment in them. Now, I don't know if you realize this or not, but what Paul has described is a state of nature. This is what comes about as a result of entropy. That just as if you allow your garden to go unattended, you don't do the jobs that have to be done. You don't do the planting when the planting is supposed to be done. You don't prune the trees when the trees are supposed to be pruned. You don't fertilize, you don't water, you don't weed, you don't dig up the things that need to be dug up and thrown away. You don't do any of those things. Your garden will go to rack and ruin. You don't dress and keep and do these things with the minds of your children. And the minds of your children are going to a state of nature as the entire civilization and society will do. And this is a description of it. The reason why this description, as overwhelming as it is so accurate in the description of modern civilization is that it's a description of the natural state of things when no order is imposed upon the mind of man and upon the minds of children. It's as simple as that. Well, you want to know what's frightening about all this? Well, just like jungles and thickets and deserts are a state of nature in the world, all these things are the state of nature for the mind. God did not make human nature evil. He gave us order, and then He left us alone, which is what we wanted, right? He gave us a nice garden. He gave us an orderly garden. He gave us design. He gave us all those good things. He put it all together and made it perfect. And then, because we wanted it, or we know He wanted it too, but we wanted it as well, He left us alone and said, dress it and keep it. Here it is. Take care of it. And when we were left alone, we descended into a state of nature. And here we are. In the modern world, all these years after Adam and Eve were told this thing, feeding knowledge into the heads of our children and making very little effort to impose any kind of moral order on that knowledge or on the mind of the child. Right? Anybody want to really argue that case? The fact of the matter is that education, the whole system of education today, is value neutral. The idea is that we can't impose the values of this religious group or that religious group or this sect or the other. We can't impose values upon our children because the question is, whose values do we impose upon them? And so the very core idea of education these days is that we will give the knowledge, but we will not attempt to impose upon that knowledge any form of moral order. And so the knowledge goes into the minds of children, and it becomes a part of the state of nature. You know, I have heard this said by parents who say, well, I don't think I have the right to impose my religious belief on my kids. When they get old enough, they'll have to decide for themselves. Now, that statement is silly beyond description. What's silly about it is the assumption that you can keep your kids from deciding for themselves. They are going to decide for themselves. Regardless of whatever efforts you make to teach them values, they are going to decide for themselves. So don't give me this stuff. Well, I don't want to teach them my religion. I don't want to impose my values on my children. That's not the point. The question is, the point is, whether you can leave your children a garden to dress and keep, or whether you're going to leave them in the jungle. That's what's at issue. Not the question of imposing your religion, or imposing your morals, or imposing your values on your children. The question is one of precisely the one that God had with Adam and Eve. He gave them what was right. He gave them order. And not only did He impose that order on the ground, He imposed that order on their minds. In this section of Romans here, there is this little statement that Paul makes, that the Gentiles, who never received the law of God, have the law of God, and they show the work of the law of God written in their hearts and in their conscience. Now, this is fascinating. C.S. Lewis, approaching this from a totally different direction, points out very aptly that no matter where you go in the world, there is a constant moral set of values that exist in every civilization. And that people, even when they do wrong things, and even when somebody comes to them to accuse them of wrong things, they will argue about whether they did it or not, but they will not argue about the right or the wrong because they know the difference between right and wrong. Written into the hearts and the minds of every man, initially, is an awareness of right and wrong and the law of God. In other words, there is a moral order that was written into the heart of man, Gentile or Jew, from the very beginning. The problem is, it must be dressed and kept. If it's not dressed and kept, the human mind will revert to a state of nature. And we will get this litany that he gave us here of the way these things are going to go, if that's what we do. It's sobering to think about and to realize, and also to begin to suddenly wake up and realize how accountable we are. For the truth is, we weren't dumped out here with nothing. We were dumped out here with a lot of it written into our genes, written into our minds and our hearts. We had a mind with a system of order. Now, think about this for a moment. God created Adam. Did He create something besides just physical stuff? Adam was made out of the dust of the ground. All right? How did that dust of the ground come to be a talking, speaking, thinking man? Well, it did this because God took the physical and He added something else to it. He added information. Information is not the same thing as the physical, stuff of life. Information is something else. Because when Adam stood up on his feet and God called his name Adam, Adam could talk back to God, which implies a language, which in turn applies a system of thought, implies a way of ordering knowledge in the mind, the brain, so that you can speak in subjects and verbs and adjectives and adverbs, so that they could communicate. All that information was written in there to start with, and it was written in there in an orderly fashion. Now, the Gentiles of the world had a knowledge to a certain level of things, in the moral order of things. To Israel, God gave far more. He gave them a far more developed sense of the knowledge of God. He gave them more laws, and therefore made them much more responsible than He might have made a Gentile. And what happens, though, to people who ignore and turn their backs on the law of God is that they wind up reverting back to the state of the Gentiles. But the state of the Gentiles, even so, if you read Paul carefully in Romans 1, is that they would not retain God in their knowledge, and so they went even further south. When the Jews rejected the law of God, wouldn't live by the law of God, they became no better than the Gentiles. And then they and the Gentiles went on south into the kind of a civilization and a world that Paul described, which could have been written yesterday in Chicago or Springfield or wherever it is we want to talk about in this country, about the state of morals and so forth. There's a fundamental error that's commonly made relative to the law of God. The presumption is that the law is a kind of magic formula. If you press the right buttons, life works for you. You get saved, you get rich, good things happen. If you press the wrong button, let's say you wear a suit that has wool and dacron in it, because the Bible says you shall not allow a garment of mixed fabric to come upon your flesh. It's in the law. It's in the book. So you do that, you fall out of favor with God, and God will punish you for it. This is legalism. It's legalism at its worst, and it causes people to lie awake sometimes at night in a cold sweat wondering what God's going to do to them because of what they did that day. It is this error also that creates the argument between law and grace that's a lot of fatuous nonsense that we wind up having to deal with and debate sometimes in talking with people about the truth. So what's the right view of the law? We often confuse two kinds of laws because of our vocabulary and the way we talk about things. So strictly for the purposes of this sermon, think of these two kinds of laws as, number one, the natural law. These are the laws designed for the survival not of any given unit but of life. Gravity, photosynthesis, the food chain. When populations become too large and they haven't taken care of their food supply, the natural law has a corrective to overpopulation. It's called famine. Or if it gets ahead of it, it'll do earthquake, tidal wave, or volcano, and that will thin us out as well. These things are all the natural law. The natural law doesn't know good or evil. It just sits there and works. You go off the top of the building, natural law says you're going to die when you hit the ground. Simple stuff. Second, though, is the moral law. And for the purposes of this sermon, I want you to toss out this old set of divisions you've got between the moral law and the civil law. The moral law, the ceremonial, sacrificial, old covenant law. Just toss all that stuff out the window for the moment. When I talk about the moral law, this is the law of God that is revealed and taught first by man, and thereafter by man to his children. It is the Torah, the teachings of God. Torah is in actuality is rather different from the Jewish view in that it does not include the traditions of the elders, but it does include the teachings of Christ. The Torah is the teachings of God for man. Let's just take that whole broad thing for the purposes of this sermon, so you'll understand what I'm talking about. That I'm not talking about the Talmud or the Mishnah or any of that stuff. I'm talking about the law of God revealed to man. This is the law that is designed to superimpose order on natural law, lest we descend economically, morally, mentally, and bodily into a state of nature. And sometimes we get worried about how close we are to that jungle that's out there. Now, with this in mind, I want you to turn back to a familiar passage in the prophets about the law and to see if maybe we can add just a note of understanding to this. It's Hosea chapter 4. Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there is no truth, no mercy, and no knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying and stealing and committing adultery, they break out, and the blood from one crime runs into the blood of the next crime. It's a terrible description of a society gone bad. Actually, a society gone to a state of nature, where the lions eat the antelopes, and where one animal eats another, and another one destroys another, and where there's fire and that rages through from lightning strokes and burns out whole sections of forest and kills everything in it. It's a state of nature. It's not the state in which you and I really want to live. Therefore shall the land mourn. Every one that dwells therein shall languish. With the beasts of the field, with the fowls of heaven, the fish of the sea also shall be taken away. But don't argue about this or reprove anybody about it, for you people are like those that will argue with anybody, even the priest. You're going to fall in that day, and the prophets will fall with you in the night, and I'll destroy. The word is not destroy, it's cut off. I will cut off your mother. My people are cut off for a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will reject you. Seeing you should be no priest to me. Seeing you have forgotten the law of your God, I will forget your children. That one is one of the most sobering and most frightening scriptures that you'll ever read. Why is this important? What he is telling us here, and essentially in these terms, is that the law of God taught to your children is what keeps your children from descending into a state of nature. It's what keeps your children from killing one another. It's what keeps your children living honorable lives instead of cheating on their exams. They begin to wake up and realize one day that a degree I get from university based on somebody else's paper has added nothing to me. The honor, the honesty, the truthfulness, the gentleness, the kindness, all those things that are taught to children out of the law of God to man, the real Torah, the teachings. These are the things that keep your children out of a state of nature. And so, because you have forgotten the law of your God, I can't do anything for your children. Do you realize that what God is essentially saying is not that He wants to forget your children. It's not that He's mad at your children. It's not their fault. What He is saying is that if you allow the minds of your children to descend into a state of nature, there is nothing that God can do for your children. I don't know about you, but I find that concept frightening. And of course, there's also this little interesting comparison. That word cut off is very close to the word castaway in the sense of what Paul was talking about, how that God gave them over to a castaway mind. You're just cut off. You're cut off to that which will elevate you above a state of nature. I don't think very many people understand this, but the reason why this country is prosperous is not because we have better dirt or better people. It's not because of the gold in our hills and the oil in the ground. It's not because of any of those things. It's because we are a nation of laws. There's a really interesting book I read not long ago that was contrasting the way things are in this country with Albania and Cuba and Africa and different places that this fellow visited. And he said, really, the bottom line when you get down to it is that we are a nation of laws. And those other nations are not. They don't pay any attention to laws. They live in a state of nature. And the further reason why our system works better is because our system of laws grew out of the laws of the Bible. A lot of people don't want to own up to that. And if you try to emphasize it too much, they'll probably do away with some of the laws because they do come from the Bible. But we have based our system on English common law, which was in turn based on in many respects on the law of Moses, which many people, again, don't seem to know. But in England, they didn't mind being the closeness of church and state or religion and state, because after all, that was where it all came from. For years now in this country, we've been chipping away at that foundation of moral law. We are no longer the nation of laws that we once were. And that's having its effect. We are returning to a Gentile level of understanding of the law instead of an Israelite, God-ordained, God-revealed level of understanding of the law. We are concerned only with what works, and we have rejected the moral basis of the law. Now, maybe you would like to take issue with that. Maybe you'd come to me after. We'll talk about it. Now, you don't think we have in this country rejected the moral basis of the law. But frankly, that's where our problem is. We are now dealing with a totally pragmatic, as the President of the United States once said just recently concerning this whole thing about Kosovo and all, we believe in what works. Tony Blair. In fact, the leadership of the Western world now is almost, they're very much the third-way politicians. And the third-way politicians, they're not the old conservatives, the old liberals, and they're not middle of the road either. Where they are is what works. And we are headed almost by admission into the fact that we are now going to try to live in nature by the survival of the fittest. We're concerned not about what's good, not about what's right. We're concerned about what works. We are returning to a Gentile understanding of the law, and our punishment, when it comes, will not be magical. It will be natural. Just natural. I want you to just think about this for a minute. In Deuteronomy 28, there is this marvelous passage. In fact, let's go back and look at this. We have enough time for that. Deuteronomy chapter 28. There's I think a clearer understanding of this in my mind that grows out of what I've been talking to you today about things coming all the way from the Garden of Eden forward. In chapter 28 it says, "It shall come to pass, if you will hearken diligently to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe all His commandments which I command you this day, that the Lord your God will set you on high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come on you and shall overtake you if you shall listen to the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your body, the fruit of the ground, the fruit of the cattle, the increase of your kind, your flocks, your sheep. Blessed will be your basket and your store. You'll be blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out." Now, this is not magic. This isn't a matter, well, if you just obey God, I will flip all these switches and all these good things will happen to you. That's not what this is about. You notice the word that if you listen to God and if you do these things, these blessings will overtake you. In other words, it's as though you're moving on down the road. You're on the right road. You're in the right direction. You're doing the things you need to do. And these blessings will catch up with you. And they become a part of your life and upon your nation. And they do so because you are imposing order in your life based on the law of God. You're imposing order on nature, and life for you, your neighbors, your people, and everybody is going to work better for you than if you don't. And what's interesting about this passage of Scripture, it says if you don't do this, if you forsake God, then all these curses will overtake you. We got an expression in our language, it's going to catch up with you sooner or later. Right? That's what he's saying. He's saying if you don't follow this way, if you don't hear this law, obey this law, do this law, it's not magic. All of it is going to catch up with you. And you're going to see the kind of degeneration that, in fact, we have seen. How many of you people have a garden? May I just say out of matter, how many gardeners we got in here? Well, I've got a lot of gardeners in this group. That's good. How many of you gardeners, or any rest of you for that matter, think you could maintain that garden merely by reading gardening books? No? That won't work, all right. How many of you think you can maintain that garden by thinking good thoughts and having good intentions? No hands went up. How many of you think you have to apply the teachings of the books and the good intentions by planting good seed, watering, fertilizing, weeding, pruning, working the soil, and supporting those plants with stakes where you got it? How many of you think you got to do that? Now, isn't that interesting? You all know that. You might as well be Gentiles. You have that knowledge because it's right there for you. Is there anyone here, gardener or not, who doesn't understand the implications of what I'm saying? What makes us think that we can maintain a family by reading good books, thinking good thoughts, having good intentions, having faith? Why should we think that? That just by the way we think about things, and maybe just by the knowledge we get and the things we know that we didn't know before. Why should we think that we can have a good family life without the Torah applied? I mean all of it. Not just the Jewish part, not just the New Testament part, all of the revealed law of God. If we don't apply ourselves to our families like we apply ourselves to our garden, our children will descend into a state of nature. And trust me, you don't want that. What makes us think that we can maintain a church? By reading good books and thinking good thoughts and having good intentions and having faith, when it won't work in a garden. Why should we think it's going to work in the church? Fact is that without a lot of work by every joint in the church body, the church also will descend into a state of nature, which is not a bad description for what has happened to the churches and what have you in different places at different times. I don't know why someone should have to tell us this, because it is so blasted obvious. It hits you in the face. And it goes all the way back to the beginning when God created this beautiful garden and said, here, I've given you what you need. Now you dress it and you keep it. And if you don't, you will come back here in a few years and you will never be able to tell where it is done, where it was. It's odd. When all is said and done, we find ourselves in the same boat with Adam. We have a garden, be it the church, be it our family, be it our life. And we have the command to dress it and to keep it. Most of us, we live our lives somewhere between chaos and beauty. Somewhere in that no man's land. And we know that it takes an astonishing amount of thought and planning and work to keep chaos from overwhelming us and our family and our church. But you know, and I know, that your family and the church and you yourself in your own life, you deserve better than a state of nature.